Imagine compassionate capitalism. Is there such a thing? Could there be such a thing?
Well, it's the most compassionate system I know, by definition.
Hello friends and subscribers, and welcome to my first retrospective. Now, I don't know about you, but it seemed that the year 2011 was the most eventful year of this decade so far. And I'm not talking about just in regards to the United States, but it seems all across the globe something was happening. Perhaps in preparation for the end of the world the next year, which, as we know, never happened. But it seems beginning in February to March 2011, we had the Wisconsin protests against newly elected Governor Scott Walker for his ending of collective bargaining for the unions. But more importantly, at the same time, the Arab Spring was sweeping across the Arab world, with protests in virtually every single Arab country, which saw mass protests against authoritarianism, bureaucracy, and the general lack of prosperity for the ordinary citizens of Arab countries to find in their homelands. These protests even sparked armed conflicts in some countries, most notably in Libya, where we saw the end of Muammar Gaddafi's 42-year reign thanks to NATO intervention, and then the war in Syria, whose bloody civil war was still going on as we speak 5 years later. Oh yeah, and then in March 2011 we had the tsunami in Japan leading to the whole Fukushima nuclear power plant crisis. In May 2011 we saw the death and capture of longtime fugitives, the most notorious being Osama bin Laden, on May 1st, 2011 after Navy SEALs raided his compound in Pakistan. A few weeks later, the Bosnian Serb General Ratko Mladic, who was on the run even longer than bin Laden was captured on a family farm just outside of Belgrade, Serbia. And then a month later, in June, we saw the capture of Boston Irish mob boss Whitey Bulger, who was at large even longer than Mladic and bin Laden were. Then in November 2011, we got the Elder Scrolls V, Skyrim, and then in December 2011, American combat forces withdrew from Iraq. But as for a personal note, do not be fooled thinking that this was the end of the war in Iraq for the United States, but I will save that point for a different video. Now, there are probably a bunch of other things that are worth noting that happened, but I feel now as if I must proceed to the main point of this video. On this day 5 years ago, on September 17th, 2011, we saw the first protests for the movement known as Occupy Wall Street. At the time, I was a senior in high school taking an AP class on U.S. government and politics, and of course the movement was a common topic of discussion. So, what was Occupy Wall Street? Well, I assume most of you who are my age or slightly younger or older, of course probably remember, but for those who are too young to remember or just plain uninitiated, let's go back to 5 years ago. The Occupy Wall Street movement was influenced by both the Wisconsin protests earlier that year and the Arab Spring protests. Although similar, the protests' motives and goals were different. To be honest, I have no idea how I'm going to lead into this, but then again, let's look at what the U.S. political and social landscape was back in 2011. We were into the third year of Obama's presidency, and the late 2000s recession was still, by and large, taking its toll on the U.S. economy. The late 2000s recession had a number of causes, but the cause that most people had up in arms was the reckless speculation and business practices of America's financial elite, or rather, what had people up in arms was the fact that the government was not only not punishing people for their actions on Wall Street, but bailing them out in the process. The financial elite were the Wall Street CEOs and the owners of private banks. Furthermore, the corporate, and by extension financial elite, got a huge boost in 2010 as a result of the Citizens United ruling, which allowed corporations and unions unlimited campaign financing for political campaigns. With all these factors put together, it became realized to most people that there was no real chance that the financial elite would ever be held accountable for their actions, because the politicians in place were already on their side, and with Citizens United, the financial elite could just buy more candidates in the already slim chance that someone rose to oppose them politically. But of course, none of this was particularly new, but that does not mean people get used to things that are not right. So what did people do? They organized and protested.
We're each doing our own thing, but we're doing it together. We're coming together and we're saying things need to be changed. How are we going to do this?
Our voices are not being heard, and that scares me. To me, that means our democratic process is broken.
So what we are making here today is the modern equivalent of the new American Constitution. Will continue to evolve. As we are doing right now. And will continue to build. As we continue to occupy this space.
We can make differences. A whole continent wide cannot control a federal government with a banking system that prints money like it's paper. You can't even call it money anymore. Gold is money. Silver is money. Green dollars are not money. They're using inflation as a hidden tax to fuck the people. Prices go up. Do your wages go up? No. My wages didn't go up, but prices went up. Gas goes up, milk goes up, trains go up. How am I supposed to live? And this is all because our government prints too much money, starts too much wars, so they can sell their tanks, their guns, their missiles, because that's all America exports. Is guns, missiles, and tanks. That's it. We need to bring production back to America.
The initial protest was planned several months prior, back in June of 2011, by Micah White and Calais Lasson, a pair of consumer advocates from Canada. On September 17, 2011, the crowds began to amass in Lower Manhattan in New York City at Zuccotti Park to protest corporatism, cronyism, wealth inequality, and the other manifestations of big government mingling with big banking and big business. The rallying cry was, "We are the 99%. Even after the first day, the initial protests began to show signs it would spawn an entire movement. Days passed, as did the weeks, and Occupy Wall Street began to spread not only to other cities across the United States, but the entire world. Occupy Wall Street became part of an overarching Occupy movement, with each people in their different countries protesting the cronyism of their governments. What made Occupy truly unique was that it had a simple message that practically everyone could agree with, no matter where you fell on the political spectrum. At least here in the United States, while the bulk of the Occupy protesters were left-leaning, all kinds of people from different political backgrounds could be found there. There were liberals, there were moderates, socialists, libertarians, anarchists, anarcho-capitalists, and even plenty of conservatives who supported the aim of the movement. All these people came together to protest not only in America, but across the world, and as most of you know, these protests lasted for months. Eventually, politicians, celebrities, and other notable people began reaching out to the Occupy movement.
Well, I think that people, especially young people, have a right to be pissed off. One of the problems people want is the forgiveness of the student loans. Why are there all these student loans? It's because the government guaranteed them. If the government minded its own business, then nobody could get a student loan.
Well, there's never been a monopoly without government involvement.
No, but my point is, if it wasn't for the government, college would be cheap. the tuitions would be low. It's only because the government subsidizes it and guarantees the loans. But who gets the shaft here? It's the kids. The colleges get all the money, and they stick the kids with the bill. They graduate with these worthless degrees with $100,000 or more in debt, and they can't get a job. And if they get a job, they're paying massive taxes. They're paying Social Security taxes to support a generation that voted in this Ponzi scheme before any of these people were born. They're paying income taxes. If there's anything left, they got to pay back their student loans, and they can't even discharge them in bankruptcy. And if they die, their parents are stuck with them.
Oh, Kerry, how you doing?
Doing good. How about you?
What are you doing here?
Well, just checking it out.
Okay, excellent. So what do you think about it?
You take the two elements, and there's as much credible happening here as there is fringe, as perhaps there's as much credible happening within the Tea Party as there is fringe.
I actually totally think that's the right analogy. Like, you know, I know a lot of people are like hesitant to make that analogy, but I'm not at all hesitant. I think the Tea Party says the same exact thing as these guys, which is we're pissed, man. We're tired of not getting represented.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
And so now, look, there'll be fringe in the Tea Party, like you said. There'll be fringe here, right? But I think the core of what's resonating on both those places that's got so many people jazzed up is we're tired. We're tired that we vote on these guys and it never makes a difference.
Right.
Whether it's conservative issues or liberal issues, it doesn't matter.
Mr. Chairman, as you know, there are people demonstrating against Wall Street in New York City and other cities around the country, and I think the perception on the part of these demonstrators and millions of other Americans is that as a result of the greed, the recklessness, and the illegal behavior on Wall Street, we were plunged into this horrendous recession we're currently in. Do you agree with that assessment? Did Wall Street's greed and recklessness cause this recession that led to so many people losing their jobs?
It had excessive risk-taking on Wall Street had a lot to do with it, and so did some failures on the part of regulators.
What proposals, when you ran recently, what were your proposals to help curb some of the abuses we're here protesting?
Well, I laid out a blueprint at Hudson University. Only the governors of states. What's happening in Wall Street, only the governors of states. The financial market in general, only the governors of states. The people in New York didn't support that because they've been punked of used to listening to someone who don't have a solution. They vote for someone who come up who may have money. I presented a blueprint at Hudson University that no one listened to. So what I need to do is ask the young people, young men and women, to overthrow the vote of their parents. This is not only happening in New York. It's happening in London. It's happening in Syria. It's happening in Bahrain. It's happening in the Arab country altogether. This is just a domino effect in what's going on there. But what they're doing now, we don't have to overthrow our government here, but we need to overthrow the vote of our parents.
My only agenda is the creation of a level playing field so that I grew up very, very working class, and I hope that the system changes towards inclusion, and that's it. And that's what I love about this so far, is that people are peaceful, they're respectful, and that it seems to come from a place of love, and that's where you want to be.
With all these factors, it had some potential momentum. So what happened next? People protested, and camped, and protested, and camped. And then, well, that's it. Kind of faded away by the second half of 2012. Why? Sadly, the Occupy Wall Street movement went nowhere fast. There are many reasons for this, and I found an article from the Huffington Post that does a pretty good job at explaining why Occupy, to put it bluntly, failed. I'm going to go through them and give my own reason to why I believe Occupy failed as a movement. The first point the author of the piece makes is that the Occupy factor itself was initial cause for failure. The initial Occupy Wall Street protests at Zuccotti and most other places in America and across the world were basically just tent cities, tucked away at the side rather than on the streets where their message can be reached by most people in the general public. There wasn't really enough exposure. The next point the author makes is actually one I disagree with. But the author claims that successful protests need leaders. And I do not necessarily believe that is true. They bring up Gandhi and Martin Luther King as examples. But if we look elsewhere, the Euromaidan in Ukraine didn't have any leaders like Gandhi or MLK. And the anti-communist revolutions of 1989 didn't have any leaders like them either. But moving on, the next point the author makes that why Occupy potentially failed was the fact many people in the movement gave the wrong impression about what it was about. While early on, the Occupy Wall Street protesters rallied behind cronyism and corporatism in general, but as they progressed with the We Are the 99%, it started to espouse a black and white message that was somewhat Marxist in tone, stating that the top 1% are only the 1% because they own everything and the 99% own so little, and because the 1% use the government to acquire the wealth and just keep it to themselves. This, of course, is a very oversimplistic explanation of things and ignores that most rich people who aren't in the government are fairly good at giving back to the people. And again, since this was Marxist in tone, this probably turned countless people off to Occupy Wall Street rather than sympathize with it. The last point the author makes somewhat ties in with my own point, or leads into it rather. The biggest reason Occupy Wall Street failed was because it had no real objectives other than to raise the issue of income inequality and the government letting the cronies on Wall Street get away with their injustices. They raised the issue, but offered no solutions. Because of this, it had no elected officials it backed and had no legislative achievements. Now we get on to my point. Why didn't Occupy Wall Street have any objectives or solutions? Think back to what I said earlier. Occupy's biggest strength was also its greatest weakness. Occupy Wall Street's diversity of opinion showed that most people can unite against something they agree is a problem. But unfortunately, Occupy Wall Street's diversity of opinion was probably the key things that led to its premature dissipation around a year after it formed. What I mean is, basically all these people with different ideas agreed that cronyism and corruption were a problem. However, because of the varying ideological perspectives on the cause and how to even solve the problem, no one agreed on how to move forward. The socialistic types advocated for socialism, while anarcho-capitalists argued for anarcho-capitalism. And obviously the people where they came from advocated what they typically espoused as well. This polarization obviously did not sit well with your average American who sympathized with the movement's overall complaint, but of course were alienated by the radical solutions offered by the more extreme elements. People trying to get others to consider each other's position did not sit well either. And it was not long for the extreme elements to attract outright weirdos and other undesirables from flocking to Occupy's ranks, driving out pretty much everyone else.
Let's just suppose that there was lots of money and there was no economic crisis there. Why should anyone pay for your college tuition?
Why?
Yeah.
It's just my opinion.
No, but I mean, give me the reason for it. Like, why should... I'd quite like a new car. Should that be paid for?
Your car?
Yeah.
No, I mean, it's whatever. People can say whatever they want.
No, of course you can say what you want, but I'm asking why that in particular, like...
Just because it's what I want.
Yeah. But I mean, you can't just have everything you want paid for, surely.
No, but I can put it out there. I can say what I want.
Your business is the Naked Life Coach. Tell me a little bit about what you do.
Well, basically I help people change their lives. I believe that we create our own reality, very metaphysical, quantum physics. So I help people change their patterns of thought and belief to shift what they experience.
And you said there's nudity involved?
It's nudity to my client's comfort level.
Nudity to, and how often do they get just completely naked?
Usually, it's like maybe 1 out of 10 that doesn't feel comfortable getting naked.
Okay.
So like the Stalinists and those people that killed millions of people, so you support that policy?
You don't have these figures to back up, you know. They're made up. You've been reading the Black Book of Communism or something like that.
If we're naked together, we have nothing to hide.
The final nail in the coffin was being the fucking hand symbols they tried to introduce.
When something's proposed, we vote like this. Thumbs up. If you agree. Side if it's neutral. Thumbs down to block.
Thumbs down to block.
If you want to show your support, instead of clapping, we go like this. Instead of booing, we go like this.
So I guess all that is left is to figure out where they went wrong. Well, as already touched upon, it was the fact that too many people could not agree on how to move forward. And you would think all these people rallying behind one cause could at least lift its feet into the air. Now, the author of the Huffington Post article even mentions what I'm about to say next. It is worth noting the Occupy Wall Street protests were not the only protests protesting cronyism. Starting within the last weeks of George W. Bush's presidency and long throughout Obama's first term in office, even outlasting Occupy Wall Street was none other than the Tea Party, who were dismissed by the smug left as racists and tools for the Koch brothers. The Tea Party initially protested the late 2008 bailouts under Bush and then continued to protest corporatism under President Obama, although they were protesting big government in general and not big business in particular. Looking at the Tea Party, like Occupy, they are no longer a thing, but at least when the Tea Party were a thing, they had some short-term success by identifying their issues and reaching a consensus on how to deal with them. They found people who were sympathetic to their cause and ran them for office in the 2010 midterms on generally Republican Party tickets and secured the White House in 2011. Occupy didn't even get that far. If people on the right who were disillusioned with their party and in this American state of affairs can organize and get some electoral success, the disillusioned people on the left can as well. But again, I believe the initial failure to reach a consensus is what did in Occupy. Which is why, unlike the Tea Party, Occupy will only be remembered as just another curious protest movement that happened one time in the United States and around the world. The author points out this is a goddamn shame considering that Occupy could have made an impact on the 2012 election if it wanted to. Maybe not the presidential one, but at least in the elections for state and federal lawmakers they could have made an impact. As for me, I supported or sympathized rather with both the Occupy Wall Street movement and the Tea Party movement, as someone who does not consider themselves left-wing or right-wing. I look back to 2012 and see how the two actually could have kind of unified and made an impact on the presidential. And I guess I saw it at the time too, but that's actually kind of a whole other story, so I'm not really going to touch upon that. Wrapping up, Occupy was probably one of the largest mass protest movements against cronyism and wealth inequality, with thousands of protests across the world. But it failed because it did not move forward, and it did not move forward because it failed to unify behind goals and people to help make change happen. All we can hope for is that if something like Occupy comes along in the future, they learn from their mistakes and they could find a way to unify and move forward. Well, I guess that was my 2 cents on the whole thing. I plan on doing more retrospectives. Maybe I'll even make a series out of this. I originally planned on doing one for 9/11, but decided to go against it since that's kind of a polarizing issue, but I'll see what else I could come up with. And I'm probably only going to save these for specific anniversaries, like 5-year or 10-year anniversaries too. So don't expect on like the 3rd anniversary of Gamergate I'm going to do one. But anyway, if you like this, feel free to post whatever you want. And of course, stay tuned because I have lots more videos coming up.